Go live now. We'll let people join for the first few seconds and then go ahead and get started.
Perfect.
All right, I see people filling in. Give it another second. All right, I'm sure people will continue to join over the first few minutes or so, but I want to go ahead and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We'd like to welcome you to our webinar where we will be covering common mistakes in retirement planning and the best ways to avoid them. So this is our first hot topic webinar, and I am pleased to welcome our presenter, Craig LoConte, who has a lot to cover, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to him to take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. And good afternoon, everyone. So as Katie mentioned, my name's Craig LoConte. I work for a company named MFS. If you're not familiar with MFS, it stands for Massachusetts Financial Services. We're actually known for having invented the very first mutual fund 100 years ago this month. Now, I haven't been at MFS that long, but I have been here. This is my 27th year. And it's been great professionally to be here this long, but it's also been great personally too, because I met my wife the very first day of training. And today we reside just north of New York City with our 3 kids. When you think of MFS, I think what's important to know when you think about these last 100 years is that at MFS, the mutual funds, the investment solutions we offer, they've always only been available through advisors. Right? We want you to have folks like you have at Nisabachia in terms of a team to assist you as you're thinking about your particular situation. So we've never been a firm where you could invest directly with us. We've always wanted you to have that advice. We think it's critical in terms of your long-term success, whether it's, planning for a vacation home, planning for college education for a child, planning for your retirement. We think it's critical that you have folks' advice. So with that being said, what I'm going to focus on today is some content we've built around some of the top IRA planning mistakes. So if you'll give me a second, I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully you should be able to see this. And basically what I'm going to do today is I'm going to break the content down into 3 parts. We're going to talk a little bit about beneficiaries and spend some time there because you need to make sure those are correct. We're going to talk about maximizing tax deferral, and then we're going to talk about minimizing penalties. So as we get started here, a couple of things in terms of beneficiaries. And when I started at MFS way back in 1997, I was actually in the service center answering phone calls that would come in from advisors and clients about their accounts. And it's important to know that when you think about, whether it's your retirement plans, IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, insurance contracts, right? Life insurance or annuities, they've all got beneficiaries attached to them. And there's 2 types of beneficiaries. There's what's known as a primary beneficiary, and then there's what's known as a contingent or secondary beneficiary. And I want to walk you through kind of what this looks like. I'll use my family as an example because it's important. And I'll give you 2 examples of how it almost went wrong. So within my house, right, when it comes to my retirement plan, if something happens to me, my wife is the primary beneficiary. So something happens to me, she's going to inherit that money. If something were to happen to my wife and I at the same time, simultaneously, then our kids, our 3 kids, are listed as those contingent or secondary beneficiaries. You can have multiple primaries, you can have multiple contingent or secondaries. But it's important to go through and review this. I'd submit on an annual basis to make sure that it aligns with what you want. We all work hard to save this money through our retirement accounts. And at the end of the day, I want it to go to my loved ones. Now, I mention this because I've said before, I've got 3 kids. My youngest, Julia, is 13. She was born back in September of 2010. And I remember, when my wife delivered her, we brought her home from the hospital. I remember printing out the paperwork to add her as a beneficiary to all of our accounts. Now, admittedly, in my job, I spend a lot of time running around New York City, and oftentimes I'm out at night delivering content like this. And so for 2 years, that paperwork sat on my desk. It was literally until Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012, where we lost power for 4 days here in New Rochelle, that I was able to actually add her as a beneficiary to those accounts. There was no intent on my end to necessarily disinherit her, but if something had happened to my wife and I at that time, she would not have been a part of the plan. So it is important to go through and make sure these things are correct. Just to give you one quick example, when back in 97, when I was in our service center, I remember getting a call from a young man and his mom's financial advisor. And ultimately, the mom was terminally ill. And when they were reviewing the paperwork and the beneficiary designations, they noticed that this young man on the phone, who was the oldest son, he was listed as the primary beneficiary. His younger brother was listed as the secondary or contingent beneficiary. Now, the older son knew that mom had no intent to disinherit his younger brother or her second son. But at the end of the day, when she was filling that paperwork out, they didn't think that she understood what those designations meant. So that's why I said up front, again, you've got a primary beneficiary. They're the person who's going to inherit the money when something happens to you. That contingent or secondary is if, God forbid, you and the primary beneficiary, something happens simultaneously to you. So make sure this is correct. It's important because ultimately these beneficiaries dictate who gets the money, regardless of what you've written in a will. That will does not supersede what occurs from a beneficiary perspective. So make sure that you go through and review this. So that's number 1. Number 2 is not planning for taxes on an inherited IRA. And let me walk you through a couple of things, because there's differences in terms of, how this money comes to you, whether you're a spouse or essentially a non-spouse beneficiary. So again, if something happens to me and my wife inherits the money, she's got a couple of things she can do with it as a spouse. She can take a lump sum distribution. She'll pay taxes on it. She can spend it however she'd like. She can treat it as her own. And I'm going to get into that in just a second in the third slide. But she could treat it as her own, or she could leave it as what's called a decedent account, where it would say Craig LoConte, deceased, for the benefit of Kathleen LoConte. And again, I'll talk through that in a minute as to why she might want to do that. But that's what happens from a spousal perspective. You got a couple of options. From a non-spouse's perspective, though, it's important to note they also have a couple of options. Again, they can take a lump sum distribution. Now, that's going to be treated as earned income for the year. They'll pay taxes on it. They get the remainder. But they also have the ability where if they've been designated as a beneficiary, then they can actually take distributions over 10 years. You used to be able to stretch it out over your lifetime, but due to one of the tax acts over the last couple of years, that window's been shortened to 10 years. And I want to spend a minute on that because as of right now, the way it's written, you don't have to take distributions every year, but you might consider it to potentially smooth out the tax hit. This is where your accountant can assist you in looking through this. If you think about, say, inheriting $50,000 in an IRA or a 401k, okay, over 10 years, that's $5,000 a year. Probably not going to move the bracket much for you. But if, let's say, it's $500,000 that you inherit, well, that's $50,000 a year. Maybe that does bump you into a different bracket. Or let's say it's $1,000,000. Now you're talking about 100,000 a year coming out. Again, could potentially move you into a different tax bracket. What's important to note is that as of right now, they are giving you the ability to take it out at the end, but it's acknowledging that in that 10th year, that definitely, depending on the dollar amount, could push you into a different tax bracket and affect what that net number is coming to you. So you've got to think about that. This is again why at MFS we spend so much time wanting folks to work with advisors and accountants and have a team to assist them in this process. Now, I mentioned before that from a spouse's perspective, they've got a couple of options, right? My wife, she can take that lump sum, she can treat it as her own, or she can put it in what's called a decedent account. And a couple of reasons why she might not want to treat it as her own is depending on, say, a difference in ages. At age 73, we all need to begin taking what's called a required minimum distribution. So the government says, all right, this money's been in there long enough. You need to start pulling money out. So let's say, for example, that I'm 68 and my wife is 74, right? If I pass away, would she want to then take that money and transfer it into her name? I would submit she might not, because now she's going to be forced to take required minimum distributions from that piece of money, because ultimately she's over age 73. This is a scenario where she would hopefully want to set up a decedent account where, again, it would say Craig LoConte, deceased for the benefit of Kathleen, and she can leave that there until ultimately I would be 73 years old. So from 68 to 73, she's got 5 years where she's not forced to take distributions from the account. The flip side of it is if she were under age 59 and a half. So my wife and I right now, we're both 49 years old. Something happens to me. Ideally, she's not going to take that account and put it in her name. She's going to leave it as that decedent account, and she's going to leave it that way until she gets to age 59 and a half. Because ultimately, if she takes a distribution before age 59 and a half, well, then she's got to pay a 10% penalty on that distribution. So she'd pay, it's treated as earned income, so she'll pay income tax on it. She'd pay a 10% penalty. What happens is if she leaves it in a decedent account, she can always take distributions, and it's treated as a distribution due to death. There's no 10% penalty for that. So if she needed to fix the roof or fix a car or whatever it is, she'd have access to the money without paying a penalty for being under 59 and a half. So again, a couple of things to be thinking about. The other thing just to be aware of is that sometimes spouses will disclaim assets. And what I mean by that is another example that occurred back when I was in the service center. We got a call one day from a young lady who, again, had her dad's advisor on the phone. And sadly, this gentleman had passed away suddenly. And as they were reviewing the documents, what they saw was that this young lady's mom was listed as the primary beneficiary, and then she and her sister were listed as the secondary or contingent beneficiaries. The challenge that this young lady was presenting was that mom and dad had been divorced for 7 years. And she was, let's call it 99.9% sure that her dad had no intent for that money to go to his ex. And so there was a form that was filled out by mom where basically the assets were disclaimed and went to the two daughters. So again, just something to be aware of. But from a spousal perspective, this is why we always say so important to make sure beneficiaries are up to date. All right, moving right along. One of the things to be aware of as we think about kind of maximizing contributions and minimizing penalties is you have a couple of different ways to move assets out of retirement plans. And there's what's known as direct transfers and also indirect transfers. And an indirect transfer is when you say have a retirement plan and you've either retired or chosen to take another job, and you say, you know what, cut that check to me, and then I'll put it into my account at Nisavacia through their broker dealer Avantax. Well, what happens is when you have that check cut to you, you've got just 60 days to get that money into that new IRA rollover. This can cause some confusion. It can create some issues where if you don't get that money in on time, the government actually treats it as a distribution. Depending on your age, you may have to pay a penalty, and you're certainly going to have to pay taxes on it. You're only allowed to do one of those in a 12-month window. So that can also create some issues with folks. And so oftentimes what we talk about is doing a direct transfer where that money goes directly from your existing retirement plan or IRA to that new IRA or retirement plan. The check never comes to you. It's basically passed from one institution to another. It's your money throughout, but this avoids, you having to worry about that 60-day deadline. So again, if you're thinking about doing anything, retiring or changing jobs, make sure your advisor is aware of that so they can make sure that the money moves appropriately. Oh, sorry, moving forward to number 5. One of the other things to think about with retirement plans is, do you work for a publicly traded company? And if you do you have access to investing in that company's stock in your retirement plan? When you retire, and again, the team at Nisavacia can help you with this, but when you retire, if you've got company stock, you've actually got a couple of options in terms of what you can do. Depending on what the cost basis is, if it's pretty similar to where the stock is trading today, then you many times can simply take that money and transfer it into either your new retirement plan or into an IRA rollover account. Where you want to be cognizant, though, is if you've got low cost basis stocks. So let's say you've worked for a company for 30 years and your cost basis is $15 on average, but the stock trades for $100 today. What the government allows you to do is basically take that money out of the retirement plan. Now, you're going to lose the tax shelter of the tax deferral, but what they allow you to do is by pulling that money out, you actually pay taxes based on your cost basis. So let's say that $15 per share, but then the difference between the 15 and the current share price, the $85, that's treated as a long-term capital gain. And so when you think about capital gains rates these days, especially at the long-term level, it's only 20%. So again, your accountant can work with you to figure out, okay, is losing the tax deferral worth it from the perspective of potentially saving in terms of taxes when you take these distributions? Again, there's a lot that goes into this process. Just know that if you work for a publicly traded company, please sit down with your advisor and your accountant before you do anything with the stock that's in there. Number 6 on the list, and we're about halfway through, is not taking advantage of Roth IRAs. So there's a couple ways to save for retirement in terms of an individual retirement account. That's also known as an IRA. There's what's known as a traditional IRA. These have been around for decades. And basically what it does is it allows you to save money for retirement under this umbrella where the money's going to grow tax deferred. With a traditional IRA, depending on your income and depending on your marital status, you may actually get a tax deduction for that contribution. And then ultimately, when you take the money out, you're going to pay taxes at that time. For a lot of folks, the thesis is, hey, while I'm working, I'm at my highest tax rate. When I get to retirement, that tax rate's going to go down, and therefore it'll be beneficial for me to pull money out at that time. Back in 1997, Roth IRAs were created. And the thesis there, from the government's perspective, was this was a way to raise additional tax revenue, where, again, depending on your income, there are some income limits that you can't exceed and still contribute to a Roth. But ultimately, if you qualify, you're going to make a contribution, same dollar amount as you could make to a traditional IRA. But in this case, you don't get the tax deduction. What happens is the money's still going to grow tax deferred, but then when you get to retirement, you actually get to take that out and you're not subject to income tax at that time. What some studies show is that when you think about, especially those early years of retirement, when you're pulling money out of different retirement accounts, oftentimes people's income tax rate doesn't actually go down. They're pulling money out to travel. They're pulling money out to see, kids and grandkids. So ultimately, the thesis might be that, hey, my tax rate will go down in retirement, but some folks are finding that's not the case. And so having a Roth IRA or some type of Roth 401k through work, it gives you that ability where if I take $10,000 out, I can spend the whole $10,000. I don't have to put $2,000 or $3,000 aside to pay taxes. So again, your advisor, your accountant can walk you through, might a Roth IRA be beneficial for you? Now, I do have to say here, it's so important to think about maximizing, what you're able to contribute to your retirement plans. When I think back to joining MFS in 1997, the maximum contribution you could put in that year was just $2,000. Over the last 2 decades, the government realizes we've got to save more for retirement. And so this year for 2024, it's $7,000. For last year, for 2023, it was $6,500. If you have not contributed for last year, you actually have up until April 15th of this year to make a 2023 IRA contribution. The government gives you a 16-month window to make contributions for a given tax year. So, theoretically, if you haven't contributed yet, you could put money in for last year and put money in for this year. If you're over age 50, I'm not there yet, but next year I'll be there. You get to put an additional $1,000 in. So important to just be aware of those numbers and, again, take advantage of it from your perspective. Now, it's not just about you. In the case of my wife, we're actually able to make a spousal contribution as well. So whether your spouse works or not, especially if they don't, you still have the ability to contribute on behalf of them. And so this is important to know, again, when you think about saving for retirement for the two of you. It is predicated on, again, the same dollar amounts as you see for someone who's working. So in my case, I can put aside $7,000 for this year. For my wife, who is home, and I don't say she doesn't work because she works way harder than I do. She's just not compensated for that work in caring for our 3 kids. At the end of the day, we can make the same dollar amount contribution for her. What's important to note here, again, back in 1997, for non-working spouses, the max you could put in per year was a whopping $250. Honestly, kind of insulting. You think about $250 over, 40 years. Great. That's $10,000. Probably not going to move the needle much in retirement. But you think about last year's, $6,500 times 40 years, that's $260,000. So, when you think about retirement, it's not just about me. It's also making sure that there's money there on my wife's side as well. Moving into the final stages here and just kind of making sure that we minimize penalties. So I mentioned earlier, once you get to age 73, the government says, all right, this money's been growing tax deferred long enough. let's start to force you to pull some money out. So you are forced to take these required minimum distributions. This is a time where often the advisor you work with will say, let's consolidate some of these retirement accounts together. And the reason they'll say that is because if you don't take out the correct amount from your retirement account as your RMD for that year, it used to be a 50% penalty on what you didn't take out. It has actually been reduced to 25, and you can appeal it to 10, but still 10%, 25% penalties. That's pretty significant, especially when you're in retirement and hopefully post your working years. So oftentimes folks will talk about consolidating assets, because what you need to know is individual retirement accounts, those are treated as one bucket. You've got to take RMDs from there. 401ks, it's another bucket. You've got to take RMDs from there. 403bs, that's another bucket. You've got to take an RMD from there. So, if I work at MFS, I've been here 27 years, work for a few more, and then go to work for a nonprofit where ideally I have a 403b through them. So I got my 401k from MFS, my 403b from a nonprofit, and then I've been saving in an IRA all along. I would need to take RMDs from all of those different buckets. Taking it from just one would not satisfy all three. And so this is where people can get tripped up. This is where you can see penalties come into play. And again, this is why oftentimes advisors will talk about consolidating that down into maybe just one account so that it's easier to manage those distributions. Another piece of the pie is what's called a qualified charitable distribution. So a number of years ago, the IRS said, we're going to give you the ability to withdraw up to $100,000 from your retirement accounts once you get to age 70 and a half. And if you take that money and send it directly to a charity, you actually don't have to pay taxes on that. It's a great deal for folks who are charitably inclined. But what I would say is, from your tax preparer's perspective and your advisor's perspective, it's really geared more towards those larger distributions. Again, the government maxes you out at 100,000. But if you're someone who is thinking about donating, $10 or $25 or $50,000 to, your local religious organization or hospital or a school, if you're over age 70 and a half, this could be a place to take a distribution from and not be subject to taxes on that. I admit, for the $25, $50, $100 distributions, probably not the best in terms of using this QCD benefit that you have, only because the paperwork, the time that's involved to document all of this, it is a lot. So it's really more for the larger distributions you might make. But just be aware of that, because it is a powerful way to not be subject to taxes. And then the last side is just being aware of, as I mentioned before, taking a distribution before age 59 and a half. You are subject to a 10% penalty. So if you can avoid that, please do. There is the ability, though, should you retire early or need to access money in a consistent basis, the government gives you the ability to take out what's called substantially equal periodic payments. And what they basically say is you can take a distribution for the greater of until you reach age 59 and a half or 5 years. And so let me give you, kind of a couple of numbers behind that. So if I'm 57 years old and retire from MFS and need to start taking distributions from my IRA, I have the ability to take distributions in a equal payment, each year, but I've got to do it for a minimum of 5 years. So even though at 59 and a half, I wouldn't be subject to a penalty, the government says I'd have to take it from 57 to 62. It's got to be 5 years to meet this requirement. If I'm 52 when I retire, well, I've got to take that distribution until I get to 59 and a half. So in that case, 7.5 years. But in doing so, I would avoid that 10% penalty. Here's where you do need to be cognizant, though. If you take an additional dollar along the way or change those distributions, the government comes in and basically takes you back to the beginning and forces you to pay a 10% penalty retroactively on all distributions taken. So that's kind of the warning sign that you see at the bottom. Again, as you think about retirement, as you get into your 50s, if you need to access money, obviously this pool is there for you, but it's being aware of how you structure the distributions so that you essentially minimize any penalties you might be subject to. So I have covered a lot in the last 30 minutes. Again, the premise for today was making sure beneficiaries are correct so that you avoid any headaches there. You've worked hard for this money. Make sure it passes to the folks you want it to pass to. Make sure you take advantage of the tax deferral that's given to us each year through retirement accounts, and that you're maximizing out those contributions. When I think about the last couple of decades, especially 15, 20 years ago, for the average retiree, give or take 60, in some cases 70% of their retirement income 15, 20 years ago was coming from a combination of a pension and Social Security. Pensions, in most cases, have gone away. Social Security is still very much there, but the government recognizes we have to save for ourselves. So they continue to ratchet up those contribution limits each year. Do take advantage of that. And then the last piece is just minimizing these penalties, whether it's required minimum distributions, that under 59 and a half, 10% penalty, just being aware of your ability to minimize those. This is where your team comes in. They can help you so much in terms of the planning and preparation for your retirement. So I know I've covered a lot. I think, Alana, you're hopping on the line, and we can certainly cover, any questions that folks may have.
Yeah, if you all want to put questions, we already have one, but if you want to put questions in the Q&A box, I'll present them to Craig. In the meantime, we did get some questions when people were signing up for the class that I wanted to go ahead and pose for you. Do you have any specific tips for newlyweds?
So, I think as you, first off, congratulations. And then second, again, I think it is about making sure you have a budget, right? So thinking about, potentially both of your incomes, what that budget looks like, looking at what your retirement plan options look like at work and taking advantage of those, looking at the ability to potentially contribute to IRAs as well. I think if your company offers a match, you definitely want to make sure you're at least putting aside enough to maximize that match from your retirement plan at work. Things like that make a huge difference. For newlyweds in particular, I would point out the power of compounding is huge, but you're not going to notice it in the first 5, 10, 15 years. It's really as time progresses into that second, third, fourth decade that you really see the compounding. And so getting started as early as possible is going to make a huge, huge difference over time.
Thank you. That makes sense. All right. So another time-based question. Do you have any specific advice for people, or maybe there are people on the line that have clients who are going to retire in the next couple of years, so they're really close?
I mean, I think as you start to think about retirement, right, it is gathering kind of where all those assets are, spending some time to look at how that money's allocated, potentially doing a review in terms of, what investments you're in and does that align with your risk tolerance. It's taking a look at what you're entitled to via Social Security. So going on to ssa.gov and looking at your particular Social Security benefits. And really, as you start to think about retirement, being aware, especially with Social Security, yes, you're entitled to it at 62, but most folks' full retirement age is somewhere between 66 and 67. And, the government, as the money grows in Social Security from 62 to full retirement age, it's growing at just shy of 7% a year. If you leave it in from full retirement age to age 70, it actually grows at 8% per year. So again, kind of sitting down with your advisor and looking at where your income's going to come from, that can have a massive impact in terms of, how much you have as time progresses, what the taxability of that looks like, and ultimately, protecting from a longevity perspective.
That makes sense. Okay, one that came in just now in the question box. For high income earners, should they do a backdoor Roth or no?
So it definitely can make sense, right? Where you're essentially making a contribution to a traditional vehicle and then converting that to a Roth. I would definitely, talk to your accountant, talk to your advisor, but that is something that I see folks use year in and year out, and can be a great way where if you might not qualify for a Roth IRA contribution based on your income limit, to definitely take advantage of that and get assets into a Roth, such that, again, when you get to retirement, you are going to have a vehicle you can take distributions from and spend every dollar that's there, not have to put money aside for taxes.
And one more question. If anybody has any others, we can slide them in if you want to put them in the Q&A box. At the time of retirement, what percentage of the portfolio should be in cash?
So that's another, fantastic question. I think it's always important to have some type of emergency, vehicle, cash savings. I know when I went through, so I was fortunate enough to receive what's called the CFP designation, Certified Financial Planner designation, a couple of years ago. And in that process, they talk about having anywhere from 3 to 6 months of money, of expense type money set aside as kind of your cash budget. So again, your advisor, your accountant know better than anyone else what your monthly expenses look like. But those, I'd say, are kind of the standards that they talk about when you go through something like the CFP, of having somewhere in kind of that 3-6 month window of cash set aside to cover emergency needs. It is so important. The last thing you want to have to do, especially if the markets are not performing well, like a 2022, is have to sell something into weakness just to meet, some type of emergency expense. Always better to have a little money set aside. Yeah, it's not going to be compounding at maybe the rate you'd like it to be, but to be able to write a check out of there long term is going to benefit you. I do see there is a question in the chat. I don't know if you're getting other questions too, but I do see there
Yeah,
one
go
more
ahead.
that I can address.
Mhm.
So the question is, I did not mention that if you have several buckets from which you have to draw RMDs, you can withdraw all the money from one bucket if the total withdrawn equals the total due from all the buckets. So what, again, you need to be aware of is when you think about IRAs, 401ks, and 403bs, they are distinct buckets. So let's say, I've got an IRA through my local bank. I've got an IRA with the folks in this Avancia through Avantax. And maybe I have, a third IRA somewhere else. To satisfy my RMDs from those IRAs, I can actually aggregate it together. So if I've got, let's say, 50,000 in each of them for a total of 150,000, I can calculate my RMD off of 150,000 and take a distribution from just one of those to satisfy that, to satisfy the IRA bucket. But then I've got to look at the 401k bucket, and I've got to make sure I get my RMD out of that. And then same thing with the 403b. I can't just take a distribution from my IRAs and have it satisfy those 3 IRAs plus my 401k plus my 401k and then 403b. You've got to delineate those. And that is what does tend to trip people up, is they'll go, oh no, I took this lump sum out. If it wasn't from a 401k or a 403b and you needed to, the government will come back to you. Again, when I started in 97, it was all based on good faith that if you didn't take the amount out, you would report yourself to the IRS. There were no files sent. These days, I know from our perspective and other firms' perspective, we send a file to the IRS every year that says this is how much is in there so that they can calculate the RMDs. So they know what we're supposed to take out. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to that. And again, where your advisor and your accounting team can help you potentially consolidate that just to make it easier.
Perfect. Well, speaking of the IRS, another question. Are the tax rates subject to change in 2026? And how should we plan for this?
So that is a good question. Gosh, I apologize. I don't know. I would have to, I can look into that and come back to you on that. I know some of the estate planning rules are set to sunset over the next couple of years. And so, it'll be interesting to see what happens on that end. But I apologize. I don't know. I don't have in front of me what the tax rates are set to look like over the next couple of years.
Yeah. Okay, another question. And we probably have time for maybe one more question if people want to sneak the last one in. Is it important to roll over 401k into IRA before you turn 73, before taking RMDs? Or can your company make the RMD distribution for you? Can you do it in UA for company stock after RMDs have started?
So you can certainly, leave your company plan in place if you would like. You do have the ability to do that. Again, it is one additional RMD to be aware of. So I would talk with your advisor and just kind of go through, what you feel most comfortable with in that type of scenario. You certainly can leave it there and take the RMD. In terms of net unrealized appreciation, once you make a decision, at that point, it's kind of all or none. They're going to force you to basically move the entire amount in that one calendar year. So, again, we've got a piece that I can forward out to Alana and Katie and Steven and have them get it to you to walk you through NUA in more detail. But the way it's written right now, you've got to move all of that money out in one calendar year. So you've got to be aware of that.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, Craig. This has been very informative. You're an excellent speaker and you covered so much in this one session. For all of the attendees on the line, we do have another webinar coming up on May 16th with Stephen Gully, our Chief Investment Officer. He's going to cover the market outlook and portfolio updates in Q2. And so you're going to get emails from both Nisbatia and Wellspring, depending on where you're kind of sitting in the next month or so to invite you to that, or you can go to our websites now to go ahead and sign up. Also, there will be a survey that comes up at the end of this session that will help us make our webinars even better. So we would appreciate you filling those out. So, Craig, do you have any last thoughts?
No, just thank you all for the time. I'm happy to forward some additional content to Alana and Katie. And again, they can forward that out to you if you have questions. But hope everyone has a wonderful long weekend and look forward to seeing you all again, hopefully at some point in the future virtually.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
Have a nice
Take care.
day. Thanks. Bye-bye.